Most people think monsters hide under the bed or in the shadows of alleyways, but sometimes monsters bleed. Sometimes they collapse on your front porch in the middle of a hurricane, looking like broken angels. Tessa Reynolds made a mistake that night, a mistake born of kindness. She opened her door to a dying stranger. She stitched his wounds. She gave him her bed. She didn't know that by saving one life, she was declaring war on the most violent crime syndicate in Chicago. She didn't know she was nursing the devil himself back to health. And by the time she realized who Nikolai Santoro really was, it was already too late to run. The storm over Blackwood Ridge wasn't just rain. It was an assault. The wind howled through the Douglas firs like a grieving widow, rattling the frame of the isolated A-frame cabin Tessa Reynolds called home. At 32, Tessa had moved to the edge of the Washington wilderness to escape the noise of Seattle General's trauma ward. She wanted silence. She wanted to forget the sound of flatlining heart monitors. Tonight, however, the silence was broken by a heavy, wet thud against her front door. Tessa froze, her mug of chamomile tea hovering halfway to her mouth. It sounded like a tree branch, or perhaps a wounded deer. But then came a low, guttural groan, distinctly human. She set the mug down, her pulse quickening. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her grip white-knuckled. She wasn't a fool. Living alone in the woods required a certain level of paranoia. She flipped the porch light on, but the bulb flickered and died instantly, likely shorted by the deluge. Taking a breath, she unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door. The wind ripped it from her hand, slamming it against the siding. Rain lashed her face, blinding and cold. Through the squall, she looked down. A man lay curled on her welcome mat. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than her car, though the charcoal fabric was now ruined, soaked in mud and something darker. "Hey!" Tessa shouted over the wind, dropping the poker to crouch beside him. "Can you hear me?" The man didn't answer. He was shivering violently. Tessa reached out, turning him over. She gasped. His face was a mask of bruising, but beneath the swelling, the bone structure was sharp, almost aristocratic. But it was the crimson stain spreading across his white dress shirt that seized her attention, a gunshot wound, center mass just below the ribs. Tessa's trauma nurse training overrode her fear. The fight or flight switch in her brain slammed into treat. "Okay, you're not dying on my porch," she muttered, grabbing him under the arms. He was heavy. Dead weight, terrified muscle and rain-soaked wool. Gritting her teeth, she dragged him across the threshold, his expensive leather Oxfords scraping against the hardwood floor. She kicked the door shut, locking out the storm, and silence returned, heavier than before. She dragged him to the rug near the fire. The light from the flames danced over his face. He was younger than she first thought, maybe mid-30s. His black hair was plastered to his forehead. Tessa ran to the kitchen, grabbing her emergency medical kit, a real kit, stolen piece by piece from the hospital over the years. Scalpels, sutures, lidocaine, heavy gauze. She returned and ripped his shirt open, buttons scattering across the floor like pearls. The wound was ugly, an entry wound, no exit. The bullet was still inside. "Damn it," she whispered. "This is going to hurt." She checked his vitals. Thready pulse, erratic breathing. He was going into shock. If she called an ambulance, it would take them an hour to get up the mountain in this weather. He didn't have an hour. She had to stabilize him. Tessa washed her hands with vodka from the liquor cabinet, poured some over the wound. He didn't even flinch. And gloved up. She injected lidocaine around the wound, praying he wouldn't wake up during the extraction. For the next 40 minutes, the cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the wet snick of metal instruments. Tessa worked with the detached precision of a surgeon. She found the slug lodged against a rib. With a steady hand, she dug it out, the metal clinking as she dropped it into a metal bowl. She stitched him up. Neat, tight sutures. She cleaned the blood from his chest, noting a strange tattoo over his heart. A double-headed hawk clutching a serpent. It looked old, tribal, or perhaps heraldic. She covered him with a thick wool blanket and sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead. Her hands were trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Who was he? People didn't get shot in the gut wearing Armani suits in the middle of the woods by accident. This was a hit. A failed execution. She reached for his discarded jacket to look for ID. Inside the breast pocket, she found a heavy leather wallet. She flipped it open. No driver's license, just a stack of cash, $100 bills, maybe $5,000 in total, and a single black metal card. On the card, embossed in gold, was a name. Nikolai Santoro. Tessa's blood ran cold. She knew that name. Everyone in the Pacific Northwest knew that name, even if they whispered it. The Santoro family wasn't just a gang. They were an institution. They controlled the shipping docks in Seattle, the real estate in Portland, and half the politicians in Olympia. Nikolai Santoro was the eldest son, the enforcer. The rumors said he had once beaten a man to death in a crowded restaurant, and no one had testified. She looked back at the man on the floor. The firelight softened his features, making him look almost peaceful. She had just saved the life of a monster. Panic flared in her chest. She should call the police. No, the Santoros owned the police. She should drag him back outside. No, that was murder. Suddenly, a hand shot out from under the blanket, gripping her wrist with the force of a bear trap. Tessa screamed, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. The man's eyes flew open. They weren't groggy or confused. They were pitch black, dilated, and terrifyingly alert. "Who are you?" His voice was a rasp of broken glass. "I'm Tessa," she stammered. "I'm a nurse. You were shot. I saved you." He stared at her, his gaze dropping to the blood on her hands, then to the medical kit, and finally to the bowl with the bullet in it. He didn't let go of her wrist. He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. She could smell rain, copper, and expensive cologne. "You shouldn't have done that, Tessa," he whispered. "Why?" she breathed. "Because," he said, his eyes sliding shut as exhaustion reclaimed him, his grip loosening just slightly. "Now they'll have to kill you, too." Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside the cabin washed in a pale grey light. The fir trees dripped rhythmically onto the roof. Tessa hadn't slept. She had spent the night in the armchair across the room, the iron poker in her lap, watching the man on the rug. Nikolai Santoro. He hadn't moved since he passed out, but his breathing was stronger now. The color was returning to his face. Around 8 a.m., Tessa stood up to make coffee. She needed the caffeine to think. She moved quietly to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking softly. As the coffee brewed, she debated her options. She could take her car and drive to the nearest town, disappear. But he was in her house. If he woke up alone, would he burn it down? Would he hunt her? She turned around, mug in hand, and dropped it. The ceramic shattered, hot coffee splashing her ankles. Nikolai was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He was leaning heavily against the frame, his face pale and beaded with sweat. But he was standing. He had found a pair of grey sweatpants she kept for guests. They were too short for him. And he was shirtless, the pristine white bandage stark against his tanned, tattooed skin. In his right hand, he held her largest kitchen knife. "Don't scream," he said. His voice was stronger today, a low baritone that vibrated in her chest. "I wasn't going to," Tessa lied, her hands shaking. "You should be lying down. You'll tear your stitches." "I've had worse," he said, eyeing her warily. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes scanning every window, every exit. He moved like a predator, fluid, calculated, despite the injury. "Where is my gun?" "I didn't find a gun," Tessa said. "Just the wallet." He cursed under his breath in Italian. He looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time. He seemed to be assessing her value, threat or asset. "Is there a landline?" he asked. "Storm knocked it out," Tessa said. "Cell service is spotty out here, usually dead." "Perfect," he muttered. He limped to the table and pulled out a chair, sinking into it with a grimace. He placed the knife on the table, within easy reach. "Coffee. Black." It was a command, not a request. Tessa felt a spark of anger cut through her fear. "I saved your life, you know." "A please wouldn't kill you." Nikolai looked up, surprised. His dark eyes narrowed. A faint, humorless smirk touched his lips. "You saved a dead man, Tessa. That doesn't make you a hero. It makes you collateral damage." "You said that last night," Tessa said, pouring a fresh cup and sliding it across the table to him. She stayed on the opposite side of the island. "Who is they?" Nikolai took a sip, the steam curling around his face. "The Volkov Bratva. Russians. And likely someone inside my own organization." He looked at the window. "How long was I out?" "About 10 hours. They'll be looking," he said. "They tracked my car. I ditched it 3 miles down the ridge, but they'll sweep the area. Does anyone know you live here?" "My sister in Seattle," the mailman. "Anyone coming today?" "No." "Good." He finished the coffee in one long swallow. "I need to leave. If I stay, they find me. If they find me, they find you." "You can't walk," Tessa pointed out, gesturing to his side. "The bullet nicked a rib. If you exert yourself, you'll bleed out internally." "Better to bleed out than be skinned alive by Sergei Volkov," Nikolai said flatly. He tried to stand, bracing his hands on the table. His face went grey and his knees buckled. Tessa was there before he hit the floor, catching him. He was burning up. Fever. "Get off me!" he growled, trying to push her away, but he was weak. "Shut up!" she snapped. She hooked his arm over her shoulder. "You have an infection setting in. You're not going anywhere, Mr. Santoro. You're stuck with me." He looked at her, his face inches from hers. The aggression faded, replaced by a confused curiosity. "You know who I am, yet you're helping me." "I'm a nurse," she said, hauling him back toward the living room. "I fix broken things, even the dangerous ones." She got him back onto the rug. He refused the bed, claiming he needed to see the door. She gave him antibiotics from her stash and a glass of water. "Why are they hunting you?" she asked, sitting on the floor a safe distance away. Nikolai closed his eyes, his breathing heavy. "Because I have something they want. Something that can bring down the entire Western Seaboard's criminal network." "What is it?" "A ledger?" he murmured. "Digital keys. It's in my tooth." Tessa stared at him. "Your tooth?" "Fake molar." He tapped his jaw. "The Russians want it. My uncle wants it. And until I get it to the commission in New York to prove my uncle's betrayal, I am a walking target." He opened one eye, fixing her with that intense, dark gaze. "You need to leave, Tessa. Take your car. Drive south. Don't stop until you hit Mexico." "And leave you here to die?" "I deserve it," he said softly. "Maybe," Tessa said, standing up. "But not on my rug." Suddenly, a sound cut through the morning air, a low rumble, an engine. Tessa rushed to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. A black SUV with tinted windows was crawling slowly up her long gravel driveway. It had no license plates. She turned back to Nikolai. He was already sitting up, the knife in his hand, his eyes devoid of pain, replaced entirely by cold, lethal focus. "They're here," she whispered. Nikolai looked at the poker she had left on the chair. "Tessa," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Do you have a gun?" "No." "Then get behind me," he said, using the wall to pull himself up. Blood bloomed fresh on the bandage. "And whatever happens, do not close your eyes." The crunch of gravel stopped. A car door slammed. Heavy footsteps crunched on the wooden porch steps. Knock, knock, knock. "Hello?" A cheerful, heavily accented voice called out. "We are looking for a lost friend. Is anyone home?" Nikolai pressed a finger to his lips. He motioned for Tessa to go to the back bedroom. She shook her head, grabbing the heavy cast-iron skillet from the kitchen rack. It was ridiculous, but it was heavy. Nikolai looked at the skillet, then at her. A flash of something like respect crossed his face. He moved to the side of the door, flattened against the wall. He nodded to her. Tessa took a deep breath. She walked to the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling only slightly. "Gas company, ma'am," the voice lied, checking for leaks after the storm. "I didn't call the gas company. Please leave." A pause. Then the sound of a silencer coughing. Thwip, thwip, and the wood around the lock splintered. The door was kicked open. A man in a dark raincoat stepped in, a suppressed pistol raised. He never saw Nikolai. As the man crossed the threshold, Nikolai lunged. It was a blur of violence. He grabbed the gunman's wrist, twisted it with a sickening crack, and drove the kitchen knife into the man's neck. The man gurgled and dropped. But behind him, 2 more men were running up the steps. Nikolai grabbed the fallen man's gun. He fired, pop, pop, dropping the second man. But the third man sprayed the room with an automatic weapon. Glass shattered. Wood splinters flew like shrapnel. Tessa screamed, dropping to the floor and crawling behind the sofa. Nikolai took a hit. She saw his shoulder jerk back, but he kept firing until the magazine clicked empty. Silence returned. Tessa looked up. The front of her cabin was destroyed. 3 men lay dead or dying on her porch. Nikolai slid down the wall, clutching his shoulder. He looked at her, blood dripping from his chin. "Pack a bag," he wheezed. "We have 5 minutes before the second wave gets here." The 2018 Subaru Outback tore down the logging road, mud spraying in violent arcs against the wheel wells. Tessa drove with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. Beside her, Nikolai Santoro was fading. The second bullet had grazed his shoulder, a flesh wound compared to the gut shot, but the cumulative blood loss was pushing him into hypovolemic shock. He was slumped against the passenger door, the stolen pistol resting loosely in his lap, his eyes tracking the passing tree line with a hazy, lethal intensity. "Slow down," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine and the gravel pinging off the undercarriage. "We have to get away," Tessa argued, glancing at the rearview mirror. It was empty, but her imagination filled it with black SUVs. "If you flip the car, we die just the same," Nikolai countered. He shifted, gritting his teeth as pain washed over him. "Get to the I-5 corridor. Head south toward Portland. We need to ditch this car before we cross the state line." "Why? It's my car. It's not reported stolen." "They have your license plate, Tessa," he said, closing his eyes. "By now, my uncle's people have access to the traffic cam network. If we stay in this vehicle, we'll be boxed in by the state troopers or a hit squad within the hour." Tessa swallowed hard. The reality of her situation was settling in like a stone in her stomach. Yesterday, she was a nurse worrying about her heating bill. Today, she was a fugitive driving a dying Mafia boss through the Pacific Northwest. They drove in silence for 40 minutes until they hit the outskirts of Castle Rock. Nikolai directed her to a grimy, forgotten self-service car wash behind a derelict gas station. "Pull into the bay," he ordered. Tessa did. "Now what?" "Now we switch," Nikolai said. He popped the door open and stumbled out. The movement made him sway, and he had to grab the side mirror to stay upright. "Switch to what?" Tessa demanded, rushing to his side to support him. Nikolai pointed to a rusted tan 1990s Ford F-150 parked near the vacuums with a "for sale" sign taped to the window. An older man in grease-stained coveralls was wiping the windshield. "Stay here," Nikolai said. He buttoned his torn shirt, straightened his posture, and for a terrifying second the injured man vanished. In his place stood the Don. He walked over to the man, pulled a thick roll of $100 bills from his pocket, and spoke for less than 30 seconds. The man looked at the cash, looked at Nikolai, and handed over the keys without a word. He didn't even count the money. He just walked away. "How did you do that?" Tessa asked as Nikolai climbed into the truck's driver's seat, then immediately slid over to the passenger side, too weak to drive. "People don't ask questions when they see $5,000, Nikolai muttered. "Drive, and throw your phone in the trash can." "My phone? It has my life in it." "It has a GPS tracker in it," Nikolai snapped. "Do it or they find us." Tessa hesitated, then threw her iPhone into the overflowing bin. She got into the truck. It smelled of stale tobacco and wet dog, but the engine turned over with a roar. They drove for 3 hours. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Nikolai was shivering again. The fever was spiking. "We have to stop," Tessa said, looking at him. His skin was grey, his lips cracked. "You need antibiotics, and I need to clean that shoulder wound." "Not yet," he mumbled. "Yes, now." Tessa pulled off the highway near a town called Kalama, finding a cheap motel, the Riverside Inn, tucked away from the main road. It was the kind of place where people went to hide affairs or drug habits. She paid cash for a room at the back. As she helped Nikolai out of the truck, his legs finally gave out. He collapsed, his arm draped heavily over her shoulders, his face buried in the crook of her neck. "I got you," she whispered, straining under his weight. "Just a few more steps." Inside the room, the decor was peeling wallpaper and a flickering neon sign outside buzzing incessantly. Tessa dumped him onto the bed. She went into nurse mode. She stripped off his ruined shirt. The shoulder wound was messy, the edges jagged, but the bullet had passed through. The real problem was the gut wound. The stitches were holding, but the skin around them was angry and red. "I need to cauterize the shoulder," she said, checking the supplies she had hastily thrown into a duffel bag before fleeing the cabin. She had alcohol, gauze, and a lighter. "I don't have sutures left." Nikolai opened his eyes. They were glassy. "Do it. This is going to be agony." "I know." He reached out, his hand trembling, and grabbed the metal headboard of the bed. His knuckles turned white. "Just don't stop once you start." Tessa heated the blade of a knife she'd found in the truck's glove box with the lighter until the metal turned blue-black. She looked at Nikolai. He nodded. She pressed the hot metal to his skin. The smell of burning flesh filled the small room. Nikolai didn't scream. He arched his back, a guttural, animalistic sound tearing from his throat, the cords of his neck straining to the point of snapping. Sweat poured off him. Tessa pulled the knife away, her own eyes filling with tears. "It's done. It's done." Nikolai collapsed back onto the mattress, gasping for air, his chest heaving. He looked at her, his eyes clearing for a moment. "You have steady hands," he whispered. Tessa grabbed a wet washcloth and gently wiped the sweat and blood from his face. The intimacy of the moment caught her off guard. Here was a man who had killed 3 people in her living room, a man who ran a criminal empire. Yet in this moment, he was just a man in pain, and she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "Why is your uncle doing this?" she asked softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Nikolai stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazily. "Greed. The Santoro family has always had rules. No women, no children, no fentanyl. My father's rules. My rules." He coughed, wincing. "Uncle Silas. He sees the profit margins in the poison. He wants to open the floodgates. He made a deal with the Volkovs to use our shipping lanes for trafficking synthetic opioids. I refused." He turned his head to look at her. "The ledger in my tooth contains the proof of his deal, the bank transfers, the names of the corrupt DEA agents he's paying off. If I release it, he goes to prison for life, and the Volkovs lose their pipeline." "So they kill you to keep the secret," Tessa concluded. "Yes." He reached out, his rough hand covering hers. His skin was burning hot. "You should have left me on the porch, Tessa." "I couldn't," she said, looking down at their joined hands. "Why?" "Because," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "I took an oath to save lives, even the ones that probably don't deserve it." Nikolai held her gaze for a long moment. The air in the room grew thick, charged with something dangerous that had nothing to do with guns or money. "When this is over," Nikolai said, his voice low and serious, "if I am still alive, I will give you anything you want. Money, a new identity, an island in Greece. Anything." Tessa pulled her hand away gently. "Let's focus on keeping you alive first." She turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into semi-darkness. She curled up in the chair by the window, watching the parking lot through the curtains. She didn't sleep, and she knew, watching the rise and fall of his chest, that she wasn't just saving a patient anymore. She was protecting him. By the time they reached Seattle 2 days later, the dynamic had shifted. They weren't just fugitives, they were a unit. They moved with a silent coordination, Nikolai scanning the exits, Tessa handling the logistics. They ditched the truck in a long-term parking lot at SeaTac Airport to throw off the trail and took a series of buses into the city. Nikolai was healing with unnatural speed. The fever had broken, and though he moved stiffly, the lethal grace had returned to his stride. They needed weapons. They needed a secure line. They needed clothes that didn't scream, "homeless drifters." "We are going to Belltown," Nikolai said, as they walked through the drizzling rain near Pike Place Market. He had pulled a beanie low over his forehead and wore a thrift store jacket, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every face in the crowd. "Who's in Belltown?" Tessa asked. She was exhausted, her hair messy, wearing jeans that felt 3 days too dirty. "Arthur Vance," Nikolai said. "We call him the tailor." "He makes suits?" "He makes ghosts," Nikolai corrected. "He supplies clean passports, untraceable phones, and custom Kevlar suits for the West Coast families. He served with my father in the 90s. They arrived at a nondescript storefront marked Vance Bespoke Tailoring. The windows were dark, the sign understated. Nikolai didn't knock. He pressed a sequence of buttons on the intercom panel. Long, short, long, long. A buzzer sounded, and the heavy oak door clicked open. The interior smelled of expensive wool, cedar, and cigar smoke. Rows of impeccably cut suits lined the walls. At the back of the shop, a man stood behind a measuring table. He was elderly, with silver hair and a measuring tape draped around his neck, holding a glass of scotch. He didn't look up as they entered. Store is closed, I'm afraid. I need a fitting, Arthur, Nikolai said, his voice echoing in the quiet shop. Something bulletproof. Arthur froze. He looked up, his eyes widening behind rimless glasses. He set the glass down with a trembling hand. Nico, Arthur breathed. My God! The news said you were dead. They found your car burned out near Mont Rainier. They said it was a cartel hit. Silas likes to control the narrative, Nikolai said, walking further into the room. Is the shop clean? Yes, of course. Arthur hurried around the counter, locking the door and flipping the sign to closed. He looked at Tessa. And who is this? This is the reason I'm breathing, Nikolai said simply. She needs clothes, something practical but elegant. And I need a phone, an encrypted satellite link. Arthur nodded, his professional demeanor returning. Go to the back room. I have a secure server. I'll pull some things for the lady. In the back room, surrounded by rolls of Italian silk, Nikolai finally relaxed his guard. He sat heavily on a leather ottoman. Tessa watched him. Do you trust him? Arthur is Switzerland, Nikolai said. He doesn't take sides. He takes money. While Arthur busied himself gathering supplies, Nikolai logged on to a computer terminal. He began typing furiously. What are you doing? Tessa asked, stepping closer. Sending a signal, Nikolai said. Not to my uncle, to the commission in New York. I'm pinging their emergency server, a proof of life code. Once they know I'm alive, Silas can't claim the throne without a vote. It buys us time. He hit enter. A green confirmation bar flashed on the screen. He spun the chair around and looked at Tessa. For the first time in days, he smiled, a genuine, tired smile that softened the hard angles of his face. He reached out and pulled her between his legs. Tessa's breath hitched. She placed her hands on his shoulders to steady herself. We might actually pull this off, he murmured, his hands resting on her waist. And then what? Tessa asked, her voice barely a whisper. You go back to being the Don? And I go back to checking blood pressures? No, Nikolai said, shaking his head. You can't go back, Tessa. You know that. Silas knows your face now. He knows you helped me. So I'm trapped, she said, fear spiking in her chest. No. Nikolai stood up, closing the distance between them. He was intense, overwhelming. You're with me. I protect what is mine. And as of that night on the porch, you are mine. It was a possessive, archaic declaration, but in the dim light of the tailor shop, with the rain drumming against the glass, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. He leaned down, and for a moment, Tessa thought he would kiss her. She wanted him to, the adrenaline, the proximity, the shared trauma. It was a potent cocktail, but the moment shattered. The front doorbell didn't chime. The glass simply exploded. A canister of tear gas rolled across the hardwood floor, hissing violently. Gas! Nikolai shouted, shoving Tessa behind a rack of heavy winter coats. Arthur sold us out. Men in tactical gear poured through the broken window, gas masks on, submachine guns raised. Nikolai didn't have a gun. He grabbed a pair of heavy fabric shears from the table. Stay down! He roared at Tessa. The room filled with white smoke. Tessa coughed, her eyes burning. She could hear the sickening sounds of a close-quarters struggle, the crunch of bone, the rip of fabric, the roar of gunfire. Someone grabbed her arm. She screamed, lashing out, but a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. Do not struggle, Miss Reynolds, a cold Russian voice whispered in her ear. Mr. Volkov is very eager to meet the nurse who ruined his plans. Nikolai! She screamed against the hand. Through the smoke, she saw Nikolai fighting like a demon. He had stabbed one attacker in the neck with the shears and was using the body as a shield, but there were too many of them. A taser prong hit him in the chest. Nikolai convulsed, his muscles locking up. He fell to his knees, his eyes locking onto hers through the haze. "Tessa!" he roared, trying to fight the voltage, but a rifle butt slammed into the back of his skull. He collapsed. "Bag them both," the Russian voice commanded, "and burn this shop to the ground. Leave no witnesses." Tessa woke up to the smell of seawater and rust. Her head throbbed. She tried to move her hands and found them zip-tied to a metal chair. She blinked her eyes open. She was in a large, cavernous warehouse. The ceiling was high and shadowed, water dripping from rusted beams. It looked like an abandoned shipyard hangar. 10 feet away, Nikolai was chained by his wrists to an overhead pipe. His feet barely touched the ground. He had been stripped to the waist, and his body was a map of fresh violence. They had worked him over. "Nikolai," she croaked. His head snapped up. His left eye was swollen shut, blood trickling from a cut on his lip. "Tessa," he rasped. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "I don't think so," she said. "Where are we?" "Port of Tacoma," he said. "Volkov territory." Footsteps echoed on the concrete. 3 men emerged from the shadows. The man in the center was a giant. He wore a pristine white suit that clashed with the filth of the warehouse. He had a shaved head and a scar running from his ear to his chin. Sergei Volkov. To his left was a man Tessa recognized instantly, though she had never met him. He looked like an older, softer version of Nikolai. He wore a tailored navy suit and looked uncomfortable. "Uncle Silas," Nikolai spat, straining against his chains. "Nico," Silas Santoro sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "You always were too stubborn for your own good. Why couldn't you just die in the woods? And miss the family reunion?" Nikolai grinned, but his teeth were stained with blood. "You look nervous, Silas. Is the Russian leash too tight?" Silas flinched. Sergei Volkov stepped forward. He held a pair of pliers in his hand. He looked at Nikolai with bored indifference. "Enough talk," Sergei said. His voice was like grinding stones. "You have something of mine, Nikolai. The digital key. The ledger." "I forgot where I put it," Nikolai said. Sergei sighed. He turned to Tessa. He walked over to her, the pliers clicking softly in his hand. He tilted her head back with the cold metal tip. "A pretty thing," Sergei mused. "Civilians are so fragile. They break so easily." "Don't you touch her," Nikolai roared, thrashing against the chain so hard, the metal pipe above groaned. "This is between us, Sergei. She knows nothing." "She knows you," Sergei said, "and I think you care about her, which makes her useful." Sergei placed the pliers around Tessa's pinky finger. "Tell me the passcode to the ledger," Sergei said to Nikolai, "or I take the finger." "Nikolai, don't!" Tessa cried, terror seizing her. "Don't give it to them." "Tessa, shut up!" Nikolai shouted. He looked at his uncle. "Silas, you're going to let this happen? She's an innocent woman. This goes against the code." Silas looked away, shame flushing his face. "The code doesn't matter anymore, Nico. Only business matters." Sergei squeezed the pliers. Tessa screamed. The pain was blinding, white hot. "Stop!" Nikolai screamed. "Stop! I'll tell you! I'll tell you!" Sergei paused, loosening his grip but not letting go. "I am listening." Nikolai slumped in his chains, defeated. "It's biometric. It needs a retinal scan and a voice phrase. I can't just give you a code. You need me." Sergei considered this. He looked at Silas. "Is this true?" His father was paranoid, Silas muttered. "It's possible." "Fine," Sergei said. He released Tessa's hand. She sobbed, cradling her throbbing finger. It wasn't broken, but it was bruised to the bone. "Cut him down," Sergei ordered his guards. "Bring the laptop. We will do the transfer here. And then—" He looked at Tessa. "We will dispose of the loose ends." The guards cut Nikolai down. He fell to his knees, gasping. They hauled him up and dragged him to a metal table where a ruggedized laptop sat. As Nikolai was dragged past Tessa, he locked eyes with her. His lips moved silently. "Get ready." Tessa blinked. Get ready for what? They were surrounded by 6 armed men. Nikolai stood by the table. A guard shoved his face toward the laptop camera. "Scan," the guard ordered. Nikolai leaned in. The red light of the scanner washed over his eye. "Access granted." "Voice phrase," the computer prompted. Nikolai took a deep breath. He looked at Silas, then at Sergei. "Voice phrase. Vengeance is a dish best served cold." The computer beeped. "Processing." Suddenly the warehouse lights turned red. A siren began to wail, a deafening, piercing shriek. "What is this?" Sergei shouted, pulling his gun. "That," Nikolai said, his voice suddenly calm and loud, "is the self-destruct protocol for the shipping manifest. And it also sends a live GPS distress signal to every federal agency in the state labeled terrorist activity." "You fool!" Silas screamed. "You've killed us all." "No," Nikolai said, grabbing a pen from the table and jamming it into the neck of the nearest guard. "I've just leveled the playing field." Chaos erupted. Nikolai grabbed the guard's gun as he fell. He spun and fired. 2 shots to the chest of the second guard. "Tessa, run!" Nikolai shouted. But Tessa didn't run. She saw a knife on the table, the one they had used to cut Nikolai's shirt. She threw herself chair and all toward the table, turned her back, and sawed the zip ties against the blade. Snap! She was free. Gunfire erupted around her. Sergei was firing wildly at Nikolai, who had dove behind a stack of crates. Silas was cowering on the floor. Tessa saw a heavy lever on the wall marked Hydraulics, Crane 4. She didn't know what it did, but she yanked it with all her might. Above them, a massive shipping container groaned. The chain holding it released. The container plummeted. It crashed down between Nikolai and Sergei, crushing 2 of the Russian guards and splitting the warehouse floor. Dust and debris exploded outward. The force of the impact knocked everyone off their feet. Tessa coughed, waving the dust away. The warehouse was split in 2 by the massive metal box. "Nikolai!" she screamed. "I'm here!" His voice came from the other side of the container. "Get to the water! Jump!" "What?" "The bay door is open. Jump into the water. I'll find you." Tessa looked at the open bay door at the end of the hangar. Below was the dark, churning water of the Puget Sound. She looked back. Silas was standing up, aiming his gun at her. "You little bitch," Silas snarled. Tessa didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted. A bullet whizzed past her ear. She reached the edge and leaped into the void. The freezing cold water swallowed her whole. The water of the Puget Sound was a shock of liquid ice that punched the air from Tessa's lungs. She went under, the darkness swallowing her, the salt stinging her eyes. For a moment, she didn't know which way was up. The roar of the ocean filled her ears, muting the gunfire above. "Kick!" her brain screamed. "Kick or die!" She surfaced, gasping, her limbs heavy with cold. The current was strong, pulling her away from the docks and out toward the open water of Elliott Bay. Behind her, the warehouse was a beacon of chaos, flashing lights, shouting men, the groaning of metal. She didn't see Nikolai. She drifted for what felt like hours, fighting hypothermia, clinging to a piece of driftwood. Finally, her knees scraped against rocks. She crawled onto a rocky stretch of beach near Alki Point, shivering so violently her teeth clattered like dice. She was alive, but she was alone. Tessa stumbled up the beach, finding shelter in a public restroom near the park. She huddled under the hand dryer, pressing the button over and over, trying to warm her freezing blood. She had to think. Nikolai was either dead or captured. Silas and the Volkoffs would be hunting her. She was the loose end. She had no money, no phone, no ID, but she had something they didn't expect. She knew their medical vulnerabilities. She remembered Silas mentioning he was paying off DEA agents. And she remembered the name of the drug, fentanyl. Tessa didn't run. She walked into the city. She stole clothes from a laundromat dryer, a mechanic's jumpsuit and a hoodie. She broke into a parked car, not to steal it, but to sleep for 3 hours. When she woke, she felt a cold, hard resolve settle in her chest. The terrified nurse who had opened the door in the storm was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen the devil bleed and survived. She needed to find the commission. Nikolai had mentioned them. The governing body in New York. If she couldn't find Nikolai, she would finish his mission. 3 days passed. Tessa moved like a ghost. She panhandled enough for food. She slept in libraries. She watched the news. Gangland violence erupts in Tacoma. 3 dead in warehouse explosion. No mention of Nikolai. No body found. Hope, fragile and dangerous, bloomed in her chest. On the 4th night, Tessa was cornered. She was walking down an alley in Pioneer Square when a black sedan rolled up silently behind her. She bolted, but a figure stepped out from the shadows in front of her. "Going somewhere, Nurse Reynolds?" It was Arthur, the tailor. His shop had burned, but here he was, wearing a fresh suit, holding a suppressed pistol. He hadn't sold them out. He had been turned, or maybe he was always double-crossing them. "You," Tessa hissed, backing away. "You told them we were there." "Business is business," Arthur shrugged. "Silas pays better. And now he's paying a very handsome bounty for your head. He wants to know if Nikolai told you any other secrets before he departed." "He's dead." Tessa felt her knees weaken. "Vaporized," Arthur lied smoothly. "Now get in the car." Tessa looked at the gun. Then she looked at Arthur's hands. He was older, shaking slightly. She didn't get in the car. She charged him. Arthur fired. The bullet tore through the fabric of her hoodie, grazing her ribs. Tessa didn't stop. She slammed into him, driving her shoulder into his chest. They hit the wet pavement. The gun skittered away. Tessa scrambled for it. Arthur clawed at her face, his nails digging in. He was stronger than he looked. He grabbed her throat, squeezing. Black spots danced in her vision. "This is it," she thought. "This is how it ends." Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the fire escape above. It dropped silently, landing behind Arthur. A gloved hand grabbed Arthur's hair, jerking his head back. A knife flashed, a silver arc in the moonlight. Arthur gurgled and went limp. The shadow shoved the body aside and reached for Tessa. She scrambled back, grabbing the fallen gun and aiming it. "Stay back!" The figure stepped into the light. He was battered. His face was a canvas of healing cuts. He walked with a limp, but the eyes, dark, intense, and burning with a terrifying rage, were unmistakable. "You have terrible aim, Tessa," Nikolai said softly. Tessa dropped the gun. She launched herself at him, burying her face in his chest. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her like steel bands, holding her so tight it hurt. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed. "I am," Nikolai whispered into her hair. To the world, Nikolai Santoro is a corpse at the bottom of the Puget Sound, which makes it much easier to kill the men who betrayed me. He pulled back, looking at her. He touched the graze on her ribs. His eyes darkened. "They hurt you." "I'm fine," she said. "Where have you been?" "Healing, planning, gathering the ghosts," he said. He gestured to the end of the alley. 3 men in tactical gear stood there, silent and heavily armed. "My loyalists, the ones Silas didn't purge." "What are we going to do?" Tessa asked. Nikolai handed her a heavy black coat to cover her jumpsuit. He pressed a fresh pistol into her hand. "Tonight, Silas and Sergei are celebrating," Nikolai said. "They are hosting a gala at the Space Needle to announce a charitable foundation, a front for the money laundering. Every corrupt politician, every bought cop, every boss will be there." He looked up at the needle piercing the night sky. "We are going to crash the party." The Space Needle's rotating restaurant offered a 360-degree view of the city, a glittering jewel box of lights. Inside, the champagne flowed. The elite of the Pacific Northwest mingled with the wolves of the underworld. Silas Santoro stood at the center of the room, raising a glass. He looked triumphant. Beside him, Sergei Volkov looked bored, picking at a tray of caviar. "To the future," Silas announced, his voice booming over the microphone. "To new partnerships. To peace." The crowd applauded. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The music cut out. A high-pitched feedback whine screeched through the speakers, causing guests to cover their ears. Then, a voice boomed over the PA system. Not Silas's voice. "Peace is a lie told by the man holding the gun." Silas froze. He dropped his glass. It shattered, champagne soaking his shoes. The elevator doors at the center of the room dinged. They slid open. Nikolai stepped out. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like armor. He was bruised, he was scarred, but he looked like a king returning to reclaim his throne. Beside him walked Tessa. She wore a sleek black dress, stolen from a high-end boutique an hour ago, her hair slicked back, her eyes cold. She didn't look like a nurse anymore. She looked like the queen of the underworld. Behind them, the three loyalists fanned out, weapons raised. "Ghost!" someone screamed. "Nikolai!" Silas gasped, backing away. "It's not possible." "You missed, Uncle," Nikolai said, walking calmly into the room. The guests parted like the Red Sea, terrified. "And you, Sergei, you really should have checked the water." Sergei Volkov snarled, reaching inside his jacket. "Don't!" Tessa said. Her voice was steady, amplified by the silence of the room. She held up a small remote detonator. "What is that?" Sergei stopped. "C4, Tessa lied. It was actually a garage door opener Nikolai had rigged with a blinking LED, but she sold it with absolute conviction. "Placed on the support beams of the elevator shaft. You shoot, we all fall 600 feet. It was a bluff. A magnificent, insane bluff." Nikolai smirked. "She's learning." "What do you want?" Silas trembled. "Money? Territory? Take it, it's yours." "I don't want your money, Silas," Nikolai said, stopping 10 feet from them. "I want your confession." He snapped his fingers. The screens around the restaurant, usually displaying ambient graphics, suddenly shifted. They displayed bank records, emails, surveillance footage of Silas shaking hands with Volkov, and finally, a video of Silas ordering the hit on Nikolai. The crowd murmured. The politicians began to edge toward the stairs. "You sold us out to the Russians," Nikolai addressed the room, his voice carrying to the other mob bosses present. "He broke the code. He brought fentanyl into our city. He tried to kill his own blood." "Kill him!" Silas shrieked at his guards. "Kill them all!" But the guards didn't move. They looked at Nikolai, the man who had led them for years, the man who had never broken his word. And they looked at the sweating, cowardly Silas. They lowered their guns. "No!" Silas screamed. He grabbed a steak knife from a table and lunged at Nikolai. It was pathetic. Nikolai sidestepped the attack with effortless grace. He grabbed Silas's wrist, twisted it, and drove his fist into his uncle's jaw. Silas crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Sergei Volkov, realizing the tide had turned, made a break for the emergency stairs. "Tessa," Nikolai said calmly. Tessa raised her pistol. She didn't hesitate. She aimed at the doorframe just ahead of Sergei. Bang! Wood splintered inches from the Russian's face. He froze, hands raising slowly. "The police are waiting at the bottom," Nikolai said. "I sent them the ledger 10 minutes ago. Enjoy federal prison, Sergei." Sirens began to wail from the streets below, a symphony of justice. Nikolai turned to the room. He looked at the other crime families, the terrified elites. "The Santoro family is under new management," he said coldly. "The drugs stop tonight. The violence stops tonight. Anyone who has a problem with that can speak to me." Silence. Absolute submission. Nikolai turned to Tessa. The adrenaline was fading, leaving them both exhausted. He reached out and took the detonator from her hand, tossing it into a champagne bucket. "You were terrifying," he whispered, a hint of awe in his voice. "I had a good teacher," she replied, her hands finally starting to shake. 6 months later, the storm was heavy over the Italian coast, rain lashing against the windows of the villa overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. Tessa sat by the fireplace, reading a book. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She was wearing a silk robe, and on her finger was a ring with a heavy, dark sapphire. The door opened. Nikolai walked in, shaking rain from his coat. He looked different, less haunted. The scars were still there, but the constant tension in his shoulders was gone. He had left the day-to-day operations in Seattle to a trusted lieutenant. He was retired, or as retired as a man like him could ever be. He walked over to her, kissing the top of her head. "Everything good?" she asked. "Quiet," he said. "No new threats. The commission is happy." He sat on the rug beside her, resting his head on her lap. It was a reversal of that first night when he had bled on her floor. Now he was whole. "Do you miss it?" he asked, looking at the fire. "The hospital? The adrenaline?" Tessa ran her fingers through his dark hair. She traced the scar on his shoulder where she had burned him with the knife. "I miss the simplicity of it sometimes," she admitted. "But I saved the only patient who really mattered." Nikolai took her hand, kissing the palm. "You didn't just save me, Tessa. You sheltered me." "And what happens when the next storm comes?" she asked softly. Nikolai looked up at her, his dark eyes fierce with devotion. "Then we let it rain," he said. "We have a good roof." Tessa smiled, leaning down to kiss him as the thunder rolled in the distance, no longer a sound of danger, but a sound of home. And that is the story of how a stormy night and a single act of kindness changed the underworld forever. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If you heard a knock on your door in the middle of a hurricane, would you open it? Tessa Reynolds did, and she traded a normal life for a love story written in blood and bullets. If you enjoyed this twisty Mafia romance, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. And tell me in the comments, if you were Tessa, would you have saved Nikolai, or would you have called the cops? I'll be reading your answers. Until next time, stay safe and keep the door locked.